There's a generation in Britain that doesn't make much noise. Not the baby boomers, who get credit for building the post-war world and blame for most of what followed. Not the millennials, who've been analyzed and written about and documented to exhaustion. Not Gen Z, who seem to exist in a permanent state of being observed. There's this other group, sitting quietly in the background. Getting on with it. Not waiting to be noticed, not particularly interested in being understood. British Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. They're your colleagues who've already identified the flaw in the plan before the presentation is finished, but won't say so unless you ask. They're your parents who never talked about their feelings but drove 3 hours without complaint when you needed them. They are the people who lived through some of the most turbulent decades in modern British history and came out the other side with a dry sense of humour and an absolute refusal to make a fuss. Understanding British Gen X means understanding the Britain they grew up in. And that Britain was a very different place. Let's start with the political weather, because it was everywhere. British Gen X came of age under Margaret Thatcher. Whether their family supported her or despised her, she was the defining presence of their childhood and adolescence, a leader who genuinely reshaped the country around them. The privatizations. The dismantling of industries that had employed entire communities for generations. The message, repeated and reinforced, that individual effort was what mattered, that there was no such thing as society, only people and their families. For a child growing up in a former mining town in South Yorkshire or a steelworks community in South Wales, this wasn't political theory. It was the sound of your dad coming home from the picket line. It was watching a neighborhood that had always worked suddenly not know what to do with itself. The miners' strike of 1984 lasted almost a year. British Gen X were children and teenagers during that period, old enough to understand that something serious was happening, young enough to have no power over any of it. And what children do with powerlessness, what they've always done, is adapt. They lower their expectations quietly. They stop assuming that the people in charge know what they are doing. They file away the lesson that security, if it exists at all, has to be built by your own hands. This ran through British Gen X like a geological seam. Deep, invisible from the surface, but structuring everything above it. But it wasn't just economics. There was a particular psychological texture to growing up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s that's difficult to fully convey to anyone who wasn't there. There was the II bombing campaign on the mainland, not a distant news story but something that occasionally meant evacuated shopping centres, controlled explosions, and the specific anxiety of living in a country where public spaces sometimes weren't safe. There was the AIDS crisis, handled initially with a public information campaign so blunt and frightening that it lodged itself permanently in the memory of every teenager who saw it. There was football violence that made certain public spaces genuinely dangerous on certain days. There was a national conversation about race, about immigration, about what Britain actually was, a conversation that was often ugly and unresolved. British Gen X grew up in a country that felt genuinely uncertain about itself. And that uncertainty became part of them. It produced something psychologists might recognize as hypervigilance dressed as composure. An ability to read a room instantly, to assess threat levels without appearing to do so, to remain outwardly calm while processing a great deal underneath. British Gen X became masters of the surface. The stiff upper lip isn't just a cliché, for this generation, it was a survival mechanism that got refined over 2 decades of practice. And it produced something else, a very particular relationship with irony. British humor has always had a dark, self-deprecating edge. But Gen X took it further than any generation before or since. Irony became their primary language, the way they navigated difficulty without showing it was difficult, the way they connected with each other without having to be earnest about it, the way they kept the world at a manageable distance. If you can make a joke about it, it can't fully reach you. This is not a shallow defense mechanism. It's a sophisticated one. And it served them well. Now let's talk about what daily life actually looked like. British Gen X childhoods had a texture that's almost impossible to imagine from a modern perspective. They played outside, genuinely outside, unsupervised, for hours. Streets, parks, wasteland, building sites if they were feeling adventurous. Parents had no idea exactly where they were between 3 in the afternoon and dinner time, and this was considered normal. The freedom was real. So was the boredom, which turned out to be one of the most formative experiences of their lives, because boredom is where creativity lives, where self-sufficiency develops, where children learn that they are capable of entertaining themselves without external input. They had Saturday jobs. Not as enrichment activities, as ways to earn money because they wanted things their parents couldn't or wouldn't pay for. Records, clothes, going to the match, working at Woolworths on the till, serving in a chip shop on Friday evenings, delivering papers at 7 in the morning before school. These jobs weren't arranged by parents or listed on early university applications. They were just part of how you operated once you were old enough. And at home, the television was a presence but not a constant one. British Gen X watched Top of the Pops on Thursday evenings with the kind of attention you pay to something that only happens once and can't be rewound. They used CFAX to check football results because that was how you found out. They recorded things off the radio onto cassette tapes, finger hovering over the pause button to cut out the DJ talking over the intro. Information and entertainment were rationed by circumstance, not by choice, and that rationing built a different relationship with both. There's a class dimension to British Gen X that can't be ignored, because class in Britain during this period was not subtle. Whether you grew up on a council estate in Manchester or in a detached house in the home counties, you knew exactly where you stood in the social order, and so did everyone else. British Gen X navigated a class system that was still largely intact, still largely determining what was available to you, still shaping the accent you spoke with and the school you attended and the opportunities that did or didn't materialize. This produced two distinct but related psychological responses. For those from working-class backgrounds, it created a kind of fierce, quiet determination, the knowledge that if anything good was going to happen, it would require working harder than the people who started further ahead. For those from more privileged backgrounds, it often created a specific form of guilt and self-consciousness that British people of this generation carry in a distinctive way. Either way, class was a presence. And British Gen X learned to operate within it, around it, or in spite of it, but never without awareness of it. Economically, this generation was hit repeatedly. They entered the workforce during or just after the recessions of the early 1980s and early 1990s. They hit their professional stride as the dot-com bubble burst. They were building equity and planning futures when the 2008 financial crisis arrived and rearranged everything again. Each time, they adapted. Not with loud complaint, complaining loudly was never really their style, but with a practical, almost resigned flexibility. You change what needs changing. You get on with it. You don't announce it. This economic battering left British Gen X with a specific financial psychology. They are suspicious of debt in a way that can look irrational from the outside but makes complete sense from the inside. They are not impressed by displays of wealth. They maintain a quiet, almost superstitious awareness that things can go wrong, because they have, more than once, and without much warning. They don't assume the good times will last, because they've seen good times end. And they have a deep, almost instinctive resistance to asking for help. Research on this generation consistently shows that they are among the least likely to seek support during difficult periods, not because they don't recognize difficulty, but because self-sufficiency was modeled so completely during their childhood that anything else feels foreign. Their parents didn't talk about struggling. Their parents managed. And so British Gen X manages, quietly and thoroughly, often carrying considerably more than anyone around them realizes. This is sometimes mistaken for coldness. It isn't. British Gen X forms deep, lasting attachments, they are just not performed. The friendships of this generation were built on shared experience and quiet reliability. On being the person who showed up. On not needing to explain yourself to someone who already understood. On the kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. They didn't bond over sharing feelings. They bonded over doing things together, watching football, going to gigs, driving nowhere in particular, sitting in someone's kitchen at midnight. The connection was real. The vocabulary for it just happened to be largely non-verbal. And now they are watching a world their children inhabit that operates by completely different rules. Everything documented. Everything shared. Mental health discussed openly and constantly. Feelings named and processed and validated in real time. A generation of young people who have been told, repeatedly and sincerely, that they matter, that their inner life deserves attention, but asking for help is a sign of strength. British Gen X observes this with a complicated mixture of emotions. Something like relief that their children don't have to carry things silently the way they did. Something like genuine bewilderment at how different it all looks. And something, quiet, rarely admitted, that might be a small, wondering envy for a permission they were never given. Because British Generation X was never told that their inner life deserved attention. They were told to get on with it. And they did. They got on with it magnificently, for decades, at considerable personal cost. They are not the loudest generation. They won't be trending on social media. They built careers and raised families and kept institutions functioning through multiple crises, and they did most of it without anyone stopping to say well done. They grew up in a Britain that was breaking apart and remaking itself. They absorbed the uncertainty and the hardship and the dark humor and the irony and the class consciousness and the stiff upper lip and the specific loneliness of a generation left largely to its own devices. And they came out the other side still standing. Still getting on with it. Still not making a fuss. Which is, when you think about it, the most British Gen X thing possible. If this resonated with you, subscribe to British Mind, and if you want to support these deep dives, hit the join button to become a channel member. It's genuinely appreciated.